Women like you are invisible until you ruin something. The words landed harder than the crystal glass shattering against the marble floor. Conversation stopped instantly across the grand ballroom of the Whitmore Grand Hotel. Beneath the glow of 3 massive chandeliers, more than 200 guests turned at once, their designer gowns rustling softly, champagne glasses frozen halfway to their lips. Naomi Carter stood perfectly still beside table 12, one hand clenched around a silver serving tray, the other trembling near the stain spreading across Victoria Hale's white silk sleeve. Somewhere in the distance, a piano player stopped mid-note. Ethan Whitmore slowly straightened his cufflinks, jaw tight with irritation. At 45, the billionaire hotel magnate had built an empire from polished perfection, and tonight was supposed to secure the biggest international partnership of his career. Every senator, investor, and executive in the room had come to witness it. But now all eyes were fixed on a young black waitress standing alone under a storm of humiliation. "I said I'm sorry, sir," Naomi whispered quietly. Her voice barely carried above the hum of the air conditioning, but it reached him anyway. Ethan stared at her for another long second, cold blue eyes sharp beneath the golden ballroom lights. Victoria dabbed dramatically at her sleeve with a napkin. "Sorry doesn't remove Cabernet from custom Italian silk," she muttered loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. A few uncomfortable laughs slipped through the crowd. Naomi lowered her gaze briefly, but she did not shrink. Her dark curls were pulled into a clean bun beneath the hotel's burgundy service cap, and although her uniform sleeves were slightly frayed at the wrists, she carried herself with a quiet steadiness that somehow irritated Ethan even more. "Do you have any idea what tonight costs?" he asked. "One mistake in this room matters." Naomi bent carefully to collect the broken glass from the floor. "Yes, sir." Ethan exhaled sharply through his nose. "Then maybe learn to act like you belong here." The sentence settled over the ballroom like smoke. Marcus Reed, the hotel's longtime head chef, looked up sharply from across the room. Even several guests exchanged uneasy glances, but Naomi simply nodded once and continued gathering the shattered pieces with measured hands. No tears. No argument. No pleading. That should have ended it. Ethan should have walked away. Instead, his eyes caught something slipping halfway from the pocket of her apron as she stood. A worn blue notebook. Its edges were bent from use, pages crowded with handwritten Japanese characters and highlighted business terms. Naomi noticed his glance instantly and tucked it away before anyone else could see. Victoria laughed softly under her breath. Probably writing poetry about rich people again. More scattered chuckles followed. But for the first time that evening, Naomi lifted her eyes directly toward Ethan. There was no anger in them. No fear either. Just exhaustion. And something else he couldn't quite place. The ballroom lights reflected faintly against the dark brown of her eyes as she spoke. "Excuse me, sir. Table 14 still needs service." Then she turned and walked away through the stunned silence, black shoes clicking softly across the marble floor while whispers followed behind her like shadows. Ethan watched her disappear beyond the golden columns toward the service hallway, unaware that within 7 days, the same woman he had just called worthless would become the only person standing between his empire and total collapse. The service hallway behind the ballroom smelled faintly of coffee, bleach, and warm bread cooling somewhere deep inside the industrial kitchen. Naomi Carter pushed through the swinging metal doors without looking back, though she could still feel the weight of hundreds of eyes lingering on her shoulders. The sounds of the gala faded behind her, replaced by the steady hum of refrigerators and the clatter of dishes rolling across stainless steel counters. For a moment, she stopped beside the employee lockers and closed her eyes. Not to cry, just to breathe. Her fingers tightened around the worn blue notebook hidden inside her apron pocket. The cover had begun peeling at the corners months ago, but she still carried it everywhere. Every page inside was crowded with translations, legal terms, business etiquette notes, and handwritten reminders from a life she no longer talked about. "You okay, kid?" Marcus Reed's voice broke gently through the silence. Naomi opened her eyes. The older chef stood near the prep station with his white apron dusted in flour, thick gray brows drawn together with concern. "I am fine," she answered quietly. Marcus glanced toward the ballroom doors. That man crossed the line tonight. Naomi reached for a clean tray from the rack. Rich people usually do when nobody stops them. Marcus let out a tired sigh. You should go home. She shook her head immediately. I cannot afford to. Somewhere down the hallway, another waiter snorted softly. Maybe she should practice carrying glasses before trying to work luxury events. A few nervous laughs followed. Naomi did not react. She simply picked up the tray and continued polishing silverware beneath the cold fluorescent lights. That silence bothered people more than anger ever could. An hour later, the gala finally began winding down. Guests drifted toward black SUVs beneath the rain-speckled glow of the hotel entrance while employees rushed through cleanup. Naomi stayed behind after her shift ended, alone in the employee dining room with a vending machine buzzing faintly against the far wall. She opened her blue notebook beneath the dim overhead light. Japanese business phrases filled every margin in neat handwriting. Merger clauses, hospitality negotiations, international contract terminology. Her pencil moved steadily across the paper as she translated another paragraph from memory. Outside the narrow window beside her table, Manhattan glittered wet and silver beneath the midnight rain. You study that stuff every night? Asked a quiet voice. Naomi looked up. It was Harold Bennett, the elderly security guard from the loading dock downstairs. He held a paper cup of coffee in one hand and leaned carefully against the doorway. Naomi smiled faintly. Most nights. Harold nodded toward the notebook. Looks complicated. It used to feel easy. College? He asked gently. Naomi hesitated for half a second. Tokyo Global Finance Institute, she answered. Harold nearly dropped his coffee. You are kidding. Naomi shook her head once. Full scholarship. Then what are you doing working double shifts in a hotel? The question lingered heavily between them. Naomi lowered her eyes back to the page. Life got expensive. Harold studied her quietly. You know, most people would have walked out after tonight. Naomi turned another page in the notebook. Walking out does not pay hospital bills. The old guard fell silent after that. Down the hall, the ballroom lights finally dimmed one by one until only soft amber reflections remained across the marble floor. Upstairs in the penthouse office, Ethan Whitmore loosened his tie while staring through the rain-streaked windows at the city below. Victoria paced nearby, irritated and sharp. You should fire her before the investors start talking, she said. Ethan barely listened. His mind kept drifting back to the strange calm in Naomi's eyes. Not fear. Not resentment. Something steadier. Something that made his own anger suddenly feel small. He poured himself another glass of bourbon and looked down toward the glowing hotel lobby nearly 30 stories below. Far beneath him, Naomi Carter stepped out into the cold New York rain wearing a thin coat and carrying that same worn blue notebook pressed tightly against her chest. 7 days before the Nakamura Holdings signing ceremony, the Whitmore Grand Hotel no longer felt glamorous. It felt hunted. Staff members moved through the marble corridors with nervous speed, whispering behind half-open office doors while lawyers carrying thick binders rushed between elevators and conference suites. The tension hung in the air heavier than the scent of expensive coffee drifting through the lobby. By Tuesday morning, even guests had started noticing it. Naomi Carter arrived for her evening shift just after 6 o'clock as cold rain streaked against the towering glass entrance of the hotel. Her dark coat was damp at the sleeves, and the blue notebook remained tucked carefully beneath her arm. She stepped quietly through the employee entrance, but the moment she entered the break room, conversations stopped. 2 waitresses near the vending machine exchanged awkward glances. Another employee quickly looked away. Naomi pretended not to notice. She tied her burgundy apron carefully around her waist and reached for the night service schedule pinned beside the lockers. Her name had been moved again. Basement lounge. Midnight shift. No guest interaction. Victoria's doing, Marcus muttered as he walked past carrying inventory sheets. She thinks hiding you downstairs fixes what happened. Naomi gave a small shrug. I have survived worse than a basement. Marcus studied her for a moment. You ever get tired of acting stronger than everybody else? Naomi's fingers paused briefly over the clipboard. Strong people usually do not have a choice. Upstairs, inside the executive conference suite overlooking Central Park, Ethan Whitmore slammed a stack of translated contract pages onto the glass table hard enough to rattle the water pitchers. This clause was not in the original draft, he snapped. Three attorneys exchanged uneasy looks while a nervous translator adjusted his glasses repeatedly. It appears there may have been an error during the revision process, one lawyer explained carefully. Ethan stared at the highlighted section. A single mistranslated paragraph buried deep within the Japanese agreement would quietly transfer operational authority of 6 international hotels to Nakamura Holdings within 18 months. $800 million suddenly balanced on one sentence nobody fully understood anymore. Fix it, Ethan said coldly. The signing ceremony is in 6 days. The translator swallowed hard. Sir, legal Japanese financial terminology can be extremely nuanced. Ethan leaned forward slowly. Then find someone who understands nuance. Downstairs in the basement lounge, Naomi wiped tables beneath dim amber lighting while a muted jazz song drifted through nearly empty leather booths. Near midnight, Harold Bennett appeared carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. Thought you might need this, he said gently. Naomi smiled faintly. Thank you. Harold sat across from her while she opened the blue notebook again between customers. His eyes widened as he watched page after page filled with complex Japanese legal terminology written in perfect handwriting. That looks exactly like the documents those executives have been panicking over upstairs, he said carefully. Naomi did not answer immediately. Instead, she flipped another page and quietly circled a phrase with her pencil. They translated this incorrectly, she murmured almost to herself. Harold blinked. You can tell just by looking at it? Naomi nodded once. It changes the entire ownership structure. The old security guard stared at her across the table. Does Ethan know you can do this? A soft bitter smile touched Naomi's face for barely a second. Mr. Whitmore already decided what I am worth. At that exact moment, 30 floors above her, Ethan stood alone beside the rain-covered windows of his office while Manhattan glowed silver beneath the storm clouds. His lawyers were still arguing behind him, voices tense and desperate, but Ethan barely heard them anymore. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he suddenly remembered the worn notebook slipping from Naomi's apron the night he humiliated her in front of the ballroom. Japanese writing. Business notes. Calm eyes that never begged for sympathy. His jaw tightened slowly. For the first time in days, a strange thought crossed his mind. What if the one person capable of saving his empire had already been standing in the room all along? Thursday evening arrived with freezing rain and flashing camera lights outside the Whitmore Grand Hotel. Black luxury cars lined the curb one after another while reporters gathered beneath umbrellas, hoping to catch a glimpse of the executives arriving for the Nakamura Holdings pre-signing dinner. Inside the hotel lobby, polished marble floors reflected gold chandelier light across hundreds of fresh white roses arranged for the event. Everything looked perfect from a distance. Up close, the entire building felt like it was holding its breath. Naomi Carter adjusted the cuff of her burgundy uniform beside the employee entrance while reading over another page from her notebook. Around her, staff members rushed nervously between elevators carrying silver trays and crystal glassware. Nobody smiled tonight. A young hostess hurried past whispering into her headset, "The translator still has not arrived." Naomi's eyes lifted slightly. Across the lobby, Ethan Whitmore strode through the revolving doors surrounded by attorneys and assistants speaking over one another in sharp, anxious voices. His dark coat dripped rainwater onto the marble floor as he removed one leather glove with visible frustration. "Call Tokyo again," he ordered. "I do not care what airport he is stuck in. Get him here." Victoria Hale followed closely beside him in an ivory designer coat, her expression brittle with irritation. "This dinner cannot fall apart, Ethan. Nakamura executives already think Americans are careless." Ethan ignored her and kept walking toward the private conference ballroom prepared for the evening negotiations. Through the open doors, Naomi caught a glimpse of the long mahogany table inside. Japanese executives sat quietly beneath soft amber lighting while interpreters shuffled paperwork with growing panic. Every movement in the room looked tense. Every smile looked rehearsed. Harold Bennett suddenly appeared beside Naomi carrying a stack of folded linens. "Looks ugly in there," he muttered. Naomi nodded slowly. "They are making cultural mistakes already." Harold frowned. "What do you mean?" Naomi lowered her voice. "The seating arrangement is wrong. The oldest Nakamura executive should face the entrance. And the white flowers, Her eyes drifted toward the centerpieces filling the ballroom. In certain formal contexts, white lilies can symbolize mourning. Harold's eyebrows lifted. "You are telling me nobody upstairs knows that?" Naomi gave a quiet, humorless smile. Powerful people often mistake confidence for understanding. Inside the ballroom, the atmosphere deteriorated by the minute. One attorney accidentally interrupted Mr. Nakamura mid-sentence. Another executive laughed too loudly during a discussion about legacy ownership. Across the table, the elderly Japanese chairman remained polite, but his expression had grown noticeably colder. Ethan sensed it immediately. Sweat gathered faintly beneath his collar despite the cool air conditioning. "Where is the revised translation?" he demanded under his breath as another assistant hurried toward him empty-handed. "Still incomplete, sir," she whispered nervously. Victoria exhaled dramatically beside him. "This is becoming embarrassing." Then came the moment that shifted everything. A senior Nakamura executive quietly slid a document across the table and asked a detailed legal question in Japanese. Silence followed. The replacement interpreter froze. His face lost color. I am not entirely certain how to explain this clause accurately," he admitted. The room fell still. Ethan's jaw tightened instantly. Across the long polished table, several Nakamura representatives exchanged restrained glances. One of them slowly closed his folder. Victoria muttered under her breath, "Wonderful." Through the partly open ballroom doors, Naomi heard every word while balancing a tray of untouched champagne glasses. Her fingers tightened slightly around the silver edge. She could feel the tension spreading through the room like cracking ice beneath water. Ethan stood near the center of the table now, trapped between impatient investors and offended international executives, while rain hammered softly against the towering windows behind them. For the first time in years he looked uncertain. And standing just outside the ballroom beneath the golden hallway lights, Naomi Carter quietly realized the empire of the man who once called her worthless was beginning to collapse in real time. The silence inside the conference ballroom stretched painfully long after the interpreter admitted he could not explain the clause. Rain slid down the towering windows overlooking Manhattan, while the executives from Nakamura Holdings sat perfectly still beneath the warm chandelier light. One of them slowly folded his hands together on the polished mahogany table. Another quietly removed his glasses and placed them beside his untouched tea. Nobody raised their voice. Somehow that made the tension worse. Ethan Whitmore could feel it slipping away now. The deal. The investors. The control he had spent 20 years building. There must be someone else available, one of his attorneys whispered frantically beside him. At this hour? Another muttered back. Victoria Hale crossed her arms tightly. This is humiliating. Across the table, Mr. Nakamura finally spoke in calm measured Japanese. The replacement interpreter hesitated again, visibly sweating now beneath the ballroom lights. He says, the young man stammered carefully. He says your company appears unprepared for international partnership. The sentence landed like ice water. Ethan's jaw tightened hard enough to ache. Around the room, assistants lowered their eyes while investors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Near the ballroom entrance, Naomi Carter stood motionless beside her silver tray. Every instinct told her to walk away. This was not her problem. Not after what Ethan had said to her. Not after the laughter. Not after being pushed into basement shifts like she was something embarrassing to hide. But then she noticed something else. Mr. Nakamura's expression. It was not anger. It was disappointment. A deep, quiet disappointment that reminded her of professors back in Tokyo, whenever students failed to respect the meaning behind business etiquette. Naomi slowly set the tray down on a nearby service table. Harold Bennett watched from the hallway with widening eyes. Naomi, he whispered carefully. What are you doing? She took one slow breath. Then another. And before fear could stop her, she stepped through the ballroom doors. Her black shoes clicked softly against the marble floor. Heads turned immediately. Victoria looked horrified. What is she doing in here? She snapped under her breath. Ethan turned sharply toward the sound, irritation already rising in his expression. But Naomi did not look at him. Instead, she faced the Nakamura executives and bowed respectfully from the waist. The room froze. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and steady. I apologize for interrupting, she said in flawless Japanese. But I believe there has been a misunderstanding regarding the ownership clause in Section 12. Every sound in the ballroom disappeared. One of the Japanese executives blinked in visible surprise. Another slowly sat straighter in his chair. Ethan stared at Naomi as if seeing her for the first time in his life. Naomi continued speaking gently in Japanese, her pronunciation smooth and natural beneath the golden chandelier light. She explained the translation error line by line, clarifying the legal terminology that had confused the interpreters for hours. Her fingers moved carefully across the document while she spoke, calm under pressure in a way nobody else in the room had managed to be all night. The elderly chairman of Nakamura Holdings suddenly exchanged a long look with his senior advisors. Then, to everyone's shock, the old man smiled faintly for the very first time that evening. Excellent, he said quietly in English. Finally, someone who understands both language and respect. Victoria's face drained of color. Ethan said nothing. He could not. Naomi Carter, the woman he had publicly humiliated 1 week earlier, now stood at the center of the room saving the most important deal of his career, while executives twice her age listened to her with complete attention. The same ballroom where people had laughed at her suddenly felt different now. Smaller somehow. Quieter. Because in that moment, every person inside it realized the waitress they had ignored was the smartest person in the room. For several long seconds after Naomi Carter finished speaking, nobody inside the ballroom moved at all. The soft rain against the windows sounded louder now, tapping gently against the glass high above Manhattan, while the scent of white lilies drifted faintly through the air. Naomi stood beside the conference table with one hand resting lightly on the translated contract, her breathing calm despite the dozens of stunned eyes fixed on her. Across from her, Mr. Nakamura slowly removed his glasses and looked directly at Ethan Whitmore. Your employee, the older man said carefully in English, understands our business structure better than the legal consultants your company hired. A quiet murmur spread around the room. Ethan felt heat rising beneath his collar. Victoria Hale forced a tight smile. Well, she said sharply, that was certainly unexpected. Naomi stepped back immediately. I apologize for interrupting the meeting, she said softly. I only wanted to clarify the translation. But before she could retreat toward the ballroom doors, Mr. Nakamura stood up from his chair. Every executive at the table instantly followed. Ethan blinked in surprise. The elderly chairman gave Naomi a respectful bow. Miss Carter, he said warmly, Tokyo Global Finance Institute should be proud of you. The room went silent all over again. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. Tokyo Global Finance Institute, he repeated. One of the Japanese executives looked surprised that he did not already know. She graduated at the top of her international economics program, the man explained. Her professor spoke very highly of her. Naomi lowered her gaze quickly. I did not graduate, she corrected quietly. I left before completing my final year. Mr. Nakamura studied her for a moment with visible sadness. Still because of your mother's illness? Naomi nodded once. The chairman's expression softened deeply. Your professors told us what you sacrificed. Ethan stared at Naomi across the room, unable to process the words fast enough. This woman had studied international finance at one of the most respected institutions in Tokyo. She spoke flawless Japanese. She understood corporate law better than half the consultants he had hired. And somehow she had spent the last year serving cocktails in his hotel, while he treated her like she was invisible. Victoria suddenly laughed awkwardly, trying to recover control of the room. Well, clearly Naomi forgot to mention she had such an impressive background. Naomi looked at her calmly. Nobody asked. The sentence was gentle, honest. Somehow that made it cut even deeper. Several investors lowered their eyes. One of Ethan's attorneys quietly cleared his throat and pretended to reorganize paperwork. For the first time all evening, Ethan could not meet Naomi's gaze for more than a second. He remembered the shattered wine glass, the whispers, the word worthless hanging in the ballroom air while people laughed around her. His stomach tightened uncomfortably. Mr. Nakamura slowly sat back down at the table. Miss Carter, he said, would you honor us by remaining for the rest of the negotiations? Naomi hesitated. Immediately. Sir, I am scheduled for service downstairs. Harold Bennett nearly choked on his coffee from the hallway entrance. A few executives exchanged stunned looks. But Mr. Nakamura smiled faintly. Tonight, I believe your responsibilities are elsewhere. Ethan finally found his voice again. Please stay, he said quietly. Naomi looked at him then. Really looked at him for the first time since the gala incident. There was no triumph in her expression. No bitterness. Only caution. As if she still was not sure whether respect from powerful people could disappear as quickly as cruelty had. Slowly, she nodded once and returned to the conference table beneath the warm chandelier light. Around the room, attorneys reopened folders while translators sat straighter in their seats. The atmosphere had changed completely now. The panic was gone. So was the arrogance. Because the woman they once overlooked had become the person everyone suddenly depended on. By midnight, the atmosphere inside the Whitmore Grand Hotel had transformed completely. The same conference ballroom that had nearly collapsed under tension now glowed with cautious relief beneath the soft gold chandeliers. Attorneys spoke in calmer voices. Translators finally stopped fumbling through pages. Even the rain outside had slowed to a gentle mist sliding down the glass skyline of Manhattan. At the center of it all sat Naomi Carter, quietly reviewing legal revisions beside executives who only an hour earlier had barely noticed she existed. Her burgundy waitress uniform looked strangely out of place among tailored suits and diamond watches, yet nobody in the room seemed to care anymore. This paragraph should reference operational licensing, not ownership transfer, Naomi explained calmly in Japanese while pointing to a highlighted section of the contract. Mr. Nakamura nodded with visible approval. Excellent catch. Ethan Whitmore remained silent across the table, studying her carefully. Every few minutes he caught himself remembering details he had ignored before. The worn notebook. The exhausted eyes. The way she never defended herself when others mocked her. Shame settled heavier in his chest each time. He replayed the memory of calling her worthless in front of an entire ballroom. Victoria Hale noticed it too. And she hated it. The moment negotiations paused for coffee service, she pulled Ethan aside near the hallway entrance. Do not tell me you are impressed by this performance, she whispered sharply. Ethan looked toward Naomi through the ballroom doors. It is not a performance. Victoria crossed her arms tightly. She embarrassed you tonight. Ethan's expression hardened slightly. No. I embarrassed myself. Victoria stared at him in disbelief. Before she could answer, two young hotel employees rushed past holding phones in their hands. One of them looked pale. Sir, the assistant said nervously to Ethan, there is something online you need to see. Within minutes, the entire mood shifted again. A video clip from the gala 7 days earlier had surfaced across social media. Someone had recorded the moment Ethan publicly humiliated Naomi after the wine spill. The footage spread fast. The crystal glass shattering. The stunned silence. Ethan's cold voice echoing clearly through the ballroom. Women like you are invisible until you ruin something. Millions of views appeared within hours. News outlets picked it up almost immediately. Headlines flooded financial websites and entertainment blogs alike. Billionaire hotel CEO under fire after viral humiliation video. Investors question Whitmore leadership following public incident. By 1 a.m, Ethan's public relations director looked ready to collapse. Sponsors are already calling, she whispered urgently. 3 investors want statements before market open. Victoria looked furious. This is exactly why people like her become dangerous. Naomi overheard the sentence while gathering corrected documents near the conference table. Slowly, she turned toward Victoria. I did not release the video. Her voice remained calm. Honest. Victoria scoffed softly. Convenient. But before the argument could continue, Mr. Nakamura stood from his chair. The elderly chairman looked first at Ethan, then at Naomi. In Japan, he said quietly, character matters more than perfection. A person who humiliates others publicly weakens himself publicly. The room fell silent again. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. He had spent years controlling headlines, investors, and negotiations with absolute confidence. Yet tonight, the only person behaving with grace under pressure was the woman he had tried to humiliate. Naomi quietly closed her notebook. "If my presence is causing problems for your company, I can leave after tonight," she said softly. Ethan looked up immediately. No, the answer came too fast. Too honest. Even he seemed surprised by it. Naomi studied him carefully across the warm ballroom light, while distant thunder rolled softly beyond the city windows. For the first time since this began, Ethan Whitmore realized something far more frightening than losing a business deal. He was becoming the kind of man he no longer respected. The city was quiet by the time Ethan Whitmore stepped out of the black SUV 3 nights later. A cold wind drifted through the narrow Manhattan street, carrying the smell of rain and roasted coffee from a 24-hour diner glowing softly on the corner. Neon lights flickered against the wet pavement while taxis hissed past in the distance. Ethan stood still for a moment outside the small restaurant, staring through the fogged glass window. Inside, Naomi Carter moved quietly between tables wearing a plain dark apron, balancing 2 plates of pancakes while an elderly couple thanked her warmly. The place was nothing like the Whitmore Grand. No chandeliers. No polished marble. No billion-dollar negotiations. Just chipped ceramic mugs, tired workers finishing late shifts, and old jazz humming softly from a dusty radio near the counter. Ethan suddenly felt more nervous walking into that diner than he had during any boardroom meeting in years. A small bell rang above the door as he entered. Naomi looked up automatically from behind the coffee station. For half a second, surprise crossed her face before her expression settled back into calm professionalism. "Good evening," she said softly. Ethan removed his coat slowly. No assistants followed him tonight. No security team. No polished image to hide behind. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. Naomi glanced around the nearly empty diner. "My break starts in 10 minutes. Ethan nodded once and slid into a booth near the window. Rainwater still clung faintly to his dark coat sleeves while the city lights reflected silver across the glass beside him. A waitress brought him coffee. He barely touched it. 10 minutes later, Naomi sat across from him holding a steaming mug between both hands. For a moment neither of them spoke. The silence felt strangely honest. Ethan looked down at the table before finally saying the words he had rehearsed all week. "I was wrong about you." Naomi watched steam rise slowly from her coffee. "Yes," she answered gently. "You were." Ethan gave a tired breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Most people would hate me after what happened." Naomi stirred her coffee once. "Hate takes energy." Ethan studied her carefully beneath the warm diner lights. "How do you stay kind after the world keeps humiliating you?" Naomi's eyes lifted toward him then, steady and thoughtful. "Because bitterness is expensive," she said softly. "Poor people cannot afford it." The sentence hit him harder than any public criticism ever had. Ethan leaned back slowly against the booth, staring out at the rain-slick street beyond the glass. "You could have let me fail that night," he admitted. "Nobody would have blamed you." Naomi nodded slightly. "Maybe. Then why help me?" For the first time since he arrived, she looked genuinely tired. Not weak. Just tired in the way people become after carrying too much responsibility for too long. "Because your employees would have suffered too," she answered quietly. "The housekeeping staff. The kitchen workers. The front desk clerks. Powerful men survive mistakes easier than regular people do." Ethan lowered his eyes again. Somewhere behind the counter, dishes clinked softly while an old man laughed quietly at a late-night television show. The ordinary warmth of the diner made Ethan feel strangely exposed without the armor of wealth around him. Naomi took another small sip of coffee. "My mother used to say character shows most clearly when nobody important is watching." Ethan looked back at her slowly. "And what does my character say?" Naomi was silent for several seconds. The rain outside softened into a light mist against the windows. Finally, she answered with quiet honesty instead of cruelty. "I think you built your whole life trying to look powerful." Her eyes held his steadily. "But powerful people do not need to make others feel small." Ethan felt the truth of it settle painfully into his chest. For the first time in years, nobody in front of him wanted his money, his influence, or his approval. And somehow, sitting across from a woman he once called worthless in a small diner after midnight, Ethan Whitmore began to understand how empty his success had really become. 1 week later, cameras flashed nonstop outside the Whitmore Grand Hotel, as reporters crowded behind velvet barricades stretching across the entrance plaza. Black SUVs lined the curb beneath the bright Manhattan morning, while news anchors spoke rapidly into microphones about the international partnership that had officially saved Whitmore International from financial disaster. Inside the hotel lobby, sunlight poured through the towering glass windows, washing the marble floors in soft gold. Employees moved carefully between reporters and investors, but something about the atmosphere felt different now. Lighter somehow. More honest. Near the grand staircase, Harold Bennett adjusted his security jacket while grinning quietly to himself. "Never thought I would live to see this place humbled," he muttered. Upstairs, the ballroom doors slowly opened for the morning press conference. Ethan Whitmore stepped onto the stage first wearing a dark navy suit and no expression of superiority left in his face. The room instantly erupted with camera flashes. Investors, journalists, and hotel executives filled nearly every seat beneath the chandeliers where only weeks earlier Naomi Carter had stood alone holding a shattered wine glass while people laughed around her. Ethan paused briefly behind the podium. For once he looked nervous. "Before we discuss the Nakamura agreement," he began carefully, "there is something more important I need to address." The room quieted immediately. Ethan glanced toward the ballroom entrance. "Miss Naomi Carter," he said softly, "would you join me up here?" Hundreds of heads turned at once. Naomi stepped through the ballroom doors wearing a simple black business suit instead of a waitress uniform. Her natural curls rested softly against her shoulders, and in her hand she still carried the same worn blue notebook. The room fell almost completely silent as she crossed the marble floor beneath the warm chandelier light. Ethan looked at her for one long second before facing the microphones again. "7 days ago," he said slowly, "I publicly disrespected someone whose intelligence, dignity, and character far exceeded my own." Reporters immediately began scribbling notes while cameras flashed brighter. Ethan continued without looking away this time. "I judged a woman based on her position instead of her value. And if Naomi Carter had not stepped forward during our negotiations, this company would have lost everything." Across the ballroom, several employees exchanged emotional glances. Marcus Reed folded his arms tightly while trying unsuccessfully to hide how proud he looked. Ethan turned toward Naomi fully now. "I cannot erase what I said," he admitted quietly, "but I can choose who I become after it." Then, before the entire room, he announced Whitmore International's new employee scholarship and education fund for hospitality workers pursuing college degrees. A soft murmur spread across the audience. But Ethan was not finished. "Effective immediately," he said, "Naomi Carter will serve as Director of International Relations for Whitmore International." The ballroom erupted into stunned applause. Naomi blinked once in visible surprise. Even she had not known about that part. Reporters immediately shouted questions across the room. "Miss Carter," one journalist called out, "how does it feel proving him wrong?" The ballroom quieted again as every camera turned toward her. Naomi stood still for a moment beneath the chandelier light, the same place where humiliation had once nearly swallowed her whole. But her voice remained calm when she answered. "I never needed to prove my worth," she said softly. "Only he did." Silence followed, deep and complete. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly, accepting the truth of her words without defense. Outside the towering windows, morning sunlight reflected across the New York skyline while applause slowly rose again through the ballroom, stronger this time. Later that afternoon, long after the reporters left and the investors disappeared, Naomi paused quietly beside the new office door on the executive floor. Gold letters now displayed her name beside the glass. Naomi Carter, Director of International Relations. She stood there for several seconds holding the old blue notebook against her chest. Then she smiled faintly and stepped inside while far below in the lobby, Ethan Whitmore watched the elevator doors close and finally understood that the most valuable thing inside his empire had never been the buildings, the contracts, or the money. It had been the people he almost failed to see.